Why didn't Dennis Wilson and Terry Melcher report Charles Manson to the police after the Tate LaBianca murders? For context, Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys and record producer Terry Melcher both knew Manson personally, especially Dennis Wilson. During the summer of 1968, over a dozen members of Manson's family lived at Dennis's mansion. Dennis Wilson even famously stated, quote, "I live with 17 girls." According to journalist Tom O'Neill, Dennis Wilson, Terry Melcher, and their friend Greg Jacobson all should have realized that Manson was likely behind the Tate LaBianca murders for various reasons. For instance, Charles Manson had discussed his helter-skelter race war theory with them. He mentioned that affluent white people were going to be murdered and that at the scenes of the murders, the killers would use the victims' blood to write messages on the walls. Manson even predicted that some of the victims would be hanged. Well, in both the Tate and LaBianca murders, messages were written on the walls in the blood of their victims. And horrifyingly, when it came to Sharon Tate in particular, she was hanged. So how come neither Dennis Wilson, Terry Melcher, or Greg Jacobson were able to put two and two together? Why didn't they contact the police and mention that it was possibly Manson behind the murders? The murders took place in August of '69, but Manson wasn't arrested until November. The police didn't know where to start looking. As a matter of fact, initially, the police thought the Tate murders and the LaBianca murders were unrelated. They suspected the LaBianca killings were a copycat murder, partly because of how similar the crime scenes were with the blood writing on the walls. Again, Manson had told Dennis, Terry, and Greg that these exact type of murders would happen. Did the three of them truly have no inclination at all that Manson was behind the Tate LaBianca murders? Or maybe for some reason, Dennis, Terry, and Greg wanted to keep quiet, even though they could have helped the police arrest Manson sooner. This is something Tom O'Neill points out in his book Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s. I'm going to share with you a quote from that book where he discusses the highly sexual relationship Dennis Wilson had with the Manson family and Manson's relationship with record producer Terry Melcher. After breaking down the very close relationships Manson had with Melcher and with Dennis, Tom O'Neill asks a very poignant question. Why didn't they contact the police? Quote, "The story of Manson and Melcher starts with Dennis Wilson. By the summer of 1968, Wilson, then 23, had reached an impasse. He'd become world famous as the drummer for the Beach Boys, helmed by his brother Brian. Now the band was in a decline, edged out by more subversive acts. He and his wife, Carol, had recently divorced for the second time. She wrote in court filings that he had a violent temper, inflicting, quote-unquote, severe bodily injury on her during his rampages. The couple had 2 young children, but Dennis decided to live as a bachelor. He moved into a lavish Spanish-style mansion in the swanky Los Angeles area, Pacific Palisades. Dennis's new mansion boasted 31 rooms and a swimming pool in the shape of California. He redecorated in the spirit of the times, zebra print carpet, abundant bunk beds, and hosted decadent parties hoping to have as much sex as possible. One day, Wilson was driving his custom red Ferrari down the Pacific Coast Highway when 2 hitchhikers, Manson family members Ella Jo Bailey and Patricia Krenwinkel, caught his eye. He gave them a quick lift. When he saw them again soon afterwards, he picked them up a second time, taking them back to his place for milk and cookies. Whether they actually had cookies or whether those quote-unquote cookies were actually sex, whatever the case may be, the girls told Manson about the encounter. The girls weren't aware of Wilson's clout in the music industry, but Manson was, and he insisted on going back to the house with them. After a late-night recording session, Wilson returned to his estate to surprisingly find the Manson family bus parked outside. To his surprise, Dennis Wilson's living room was filled with topless girls. Whatever alarm Dennis may have felt initially was immediately put to ease when Charles Manson sunk to his knees and kissed Wilson's feet. This night ushered in a summer of ceaseless partying for Dennis Wilson. Charles Manson and his family set up shop in Dennis Wilson's house, and soon Manson recruited one of the group's deadliest members, Tex Watson, who picked him up hitchhiking. The Manson family spent their days smoking dope and listening to Charlie strum the guitar. The girls made the meals, did the laundry, and most importantly, slept with the men on command. Manson prescribed sex 7 times a day, before and after all 3 meals and once in the middle of the night. It was as if we were kings just because we were men, Tex Watson later wrote. Soon, Dennis Wilson was bragging so much that he landed a headline in Record Mirror, a now defunct British newspaper, stating, "I live with 17 girls." Talking to Rave magazine, Dennis Wilson offered disjointed remarks about his new friend, who he called the Wizard. "Sometimes the Wizard frightens me. The Wizard is Charles Manson, a friend of mine who thinks he is God and the devil. He sings, plays, and writes poetry, and he may be another artist for Brother Records." Brother Records being the Beach Boys record label. That last bit excited Manson, who was desperate to leverage his connection with Wilson into a music career. The two of them co-wrote a song titled "Cease to Exist," whose lyrics claim that submission is a gift. Later that year, the Beach Boys recorded the song, but they changed the title, finessed the lyrics, and dropped Manson's songwriting credit, a snub that fueled his anger towards the establishment. Manson hung out with some of the biggest names in music. Neil Young remembered meeting Manson and the girls at Wilson's place. "A lot of pretty well-known musicians around Los Angeles knew Manson," Young later said, though they'd probably deny it now. Among these was Terry Melcher. He and Wilson had pledged allegiance to the, quote, Golden Penetrators, a horny triumvirate they'd formed with their friend Greg Jacobson. The Penetrators, who'd painted a gold car to celebrate themselves, aimed to sleep with as many women as they could. Wilson's ex-wife referred to them as a quote-unquote roving coxman. Obviously, then, Terry Melcher would want to rove over to Wilson's house. It was full of promiscuous young women. Sometime in that summer of '68, at one of Wilson's marathon parties, he crossed paths with Manson for the first time. After another such party, Melcher rode back to Cielo Drive with Wilson, and Manson came along in the back seat. As Melcher later testified, Manson got a good look at the house from the driveway. When the end of the summer finally came, things went south with Wilson, who'd finally grown tired of footing the bill for the endless party. Upwards of $100,000 in food, clothes, and car repairs, plus gonorrhea treatments. According to Vincent Bugliosi, Manson's future prosecutor, Dennis Wilson was too frightened of Manson to throw him out. Instead, Dennis simply up and left in the middle of the night, leaving the messy business of eviction to his landlord. But it must have been more complicated than that. Wilson gave 3 interviews in which he raved about Manson and the girls, and all of those interviews date to the winter and summer of '69, which is nearly a year after he and the family had supposedly parted ways. Thus, why would Dennis Wilson brag about his connections to a man he'd just schemed to escape? The only sure fact is that Manson and his group decamped to Spahn Ranch in late August of '68. Wilson moved into a Malibu beach house with Greg Jacobson, who'd recently also split from his marriage. Having drifted from Dennis Wilson, his best shot at a record deal, Manson knew he had to hitch his wagon to Terry Melcher. As Manson's chances for fame dwindled, his mood darkened. He became obsessed with the Beatles' White Album, released in late November of 1968. Manson started to preach about the prophecies of a race war embedded in its lyrics. Things only got worse in early 1969, when Manson invited Melcher to come out and listen to his music. Manson prepared meticulously for the prospective meeting, but Melcher stood him up. On March 23, 1969, a desperate Charles Manson went searching for producer Terry Melcher. Manson thought he could goad the producer, he could urge him into a record deal. And thus, Manson found his way back to the house at Cielo Drive. He remembered Terry Melcher lived there. But instead of Melcher, Sharon Tate's personal photographer, Shahrokh Hatami, intercepted Manson. The photographer Hatami had never heard of Terry Melcher. He told Manson to go to the guest house and talk to the owner of the property, Rudolph Altobelli. Rudolph explained to Manson that Melcher no longer lived here. Manson prevailed on Greg Jacobson, who was still a friend and still a fan of his girls, to book another session with Melcher. This time, it worked. That May, Melcher made the winding drive to the Spahn Ranch and auditioned Manson in person, visiting twice over 4 days. Manson had rounded out a dozen or so of his best songs with backing singing from the girls. Performing in a gully in the woods, the girls sprawled on the ground and gazed up at their leader, who sat atop a rock with his guitar in hand. "I wasn't too impressed by the songs," Melcher would later testify. "I was impressed by the whole scene, by Charlie's strength and his obvious leadership." As a courtesy, the producer complimented Manson, saying that 1 or 2 of his songs were quote-unquote nice. Melcher had no intention of offering a recording contract, but he saw how the family's rustic, cultish lifestyle would lend itself to a TV documentary. Melcher suggested that his friend, Mike Deasy, whose van was outfitted to make field recordings, could come out to the ranch and capture another performance. Now, before Melcher could get out of there, a man at the ranch came stumbling out of a pickup truck. Drunk and belligerent, he was dressed like a cowboy, fingering a holstered gun, the same one that would later be used at the Tate murders. Manson stepped up to him and shouted, "Don't draw on me," socking him in the gut, taking his gun and continuing to pummel him. It spooked Melcher. Here was a peace and love cult with naked girls roaming the old Western sets, and yet the constant threat of violence loomed over the place. It was so bizarre it needed to be documented. And so a few days later, Melcher returned with Deasy and Jacobson, and the family repeated their audition. But what had seemed spontaneous now felt rehearsed. Deasy returned a few more times until he had a frightening LSD trip with Manson and vowed never to go back. It was all getting too toxic. Melcher conveyed his rejection of Manson through Jacobson, and that was the end of that. Manson's last brush with greatness was gone, and he became full-on apocalyptic. Terry Melcher never went back to the ranch or saw anyone from the family ever again. Or at least that's what he said under oath, anyway. After the murders, as Hollywood panicked and the LAPD chased down the leads, the golden penetrators realized that they hadn't yet quite washed their hands of Manson. This is where their story began to feel unbelievable to me. Manson wasn't charged with murder until late November, but Wilson, Jacobson, and Melcher had good cause to suspect him back in August, right after the killings. By then, they were frightened of Manson, but Helter Skelter does little to indicate their terror. When I saw how much they knew and how quiet they'd kept despite the fact their information would have helped the police solve the case, I realized just how flimsy the Helter Skelter motive was. Its unforgettable grandiosity may have hidden a more proastic truth, that a few rich guys had gotten in over their heads with an unstable ex-con. First of all, Wilson and Jacobson knew that Manson had shot a black man named Bernard Crowe about 5 weeks before the Tate murders, and Jacobson in particular, who testified that he'd talked to Manson upwards of 100 times, was well acquainted with his friend's bizarre race war predictions. Manson had warned Jacobson that the quote-unquote whiteys in affluent homes in Bel Air would be cut up and dismembered, and that the murderers would smear the victims' blood on the walls and hang them from the ceiling. And yet, when a group of affluent whites really was cut up and Sharon Tate was hung from the ceiling of her home, Jacobson apparently didn't make the connection. Nor did it occur to him in mid-August when he witnessed Manson's violence firsthand. Manson broke into Jacobson's home in the middle of the night, shook him awake, and produced a bullet. "Tell Dennis there are more where this came from," he said. On the witness stand, Jacobson compared Manson that night to a caged bobcat. The electricity was almost pouring out of him, his hair was on end, his eyes were wild. A few days earlier, Manson had shown up at Wilson's house too, demanding $1,500. When Wilson refused to give him the money, Manson threatened him. "Don't be surprised if you never see your kid again." After Manson's eventual arrest, Wilson fell into a deep depression, spurring his problems with drugs and alcohol. Later, he told Beach Boys authorized biographer David Leaf, "I know why Charles Manson did what he did. Someday, I'll tell the world. I'll write a book and explain why he did it." Unfortunately, he never got the chance. In 1983, 3 weeks after his 39th birthday, an acutely drunk Wilson dove from the deck of his boat into the chilly waters of the Marina del Rey. He accidentally drowned. Within days, a rock journalist wrote in the San Francisco Chronicle about a jarring exchange he'd had with Wilson. "Me and Charlie, we founded the family," Dennis had said, apropos of nothing. The Golden Penetrators had an abundance of reasons to accuse Manson of the Tate LaBianca murders, immediately. They believed he'd shot someone dead, he threatened 2 of them with violence, and they knew he'd stockpiled guns and knives at the ranch. And the slaughter at Melcher's old house was exactly the kind Manson predicted, down to the most chilling detail. Shouldn't they have connected the dots, or was it possible that there was a conspiracy of silence among them? End quote. There are so many unanswered questions and loose ends that Tom O'Neill has uncovered about the official Manson murder narrative. What is true and what isn't? That's something people are still trying to figure out. Now, interestingly, in 2025, during the massive Los Angeles fires, the Pacific Palisades area was largely decimated. Yet, Dennis Wilson's former house, the Charles Manson crash pad in the Pacific Palisades, was essentially left untouched. Now, I don't think there's any sort of conspiracy as to why Dennis's former house survived the fires, but it's an interesting bit of trivia. I do believe that there is some very shady stuff in general about the LA fires, but that's a different topic. In any case, I want to read to you an article from The Hollywood Reporter by Lily Ford regarding the Dennis Wilson Manson family house surviving the LA fires. And following this article, I have more to share about the Wilson-Manson connection. Quote, "The former home of the late Dennis Wilson, member of the Beach Boys and once a friend of the Manson family, is still standing after the Pacific Palisades fire. 14400 Sunset Boulevard, where in the late 60s, Wilson would regularly host cult leader Charles Manson and many of his female followers, was photographed seemingly unscathed by the wildfires which have torn across Southern California. Dennis Wilson was reportedly fascinated by Manson and his followers as the two of them struck up a friendship in 1968. Many women, all of them of the Manson family, were housed at the residence that summer and cost Dennis Wilson around $100,000, equivalent to $900,000 in 2025. In late 1968, Wilson told the Record Mirror magazine, "When I met Manson, I found he had great musical ideas. We're writing together now. He's dumb in some ways, but I accept his approach and have learned from him." He told reporters at the time that he had been living with 17 women. When asked if he was supporting them, Wilson replied, "No. If anything, they're supporting me. I had all the rich status symbols, Rolls-Royce, Ferrari, home after home. Then I woke up and gave away 50 to 60% of my money. Now I live in one small room with one candle, and I'm happy, finding myself." It was reportedly at Wilson's house parties where Manson was able to meet Hollywood celebrities. In the summer of 1968, Manson recorded several tracks at Brian Wilson's home studio, though the recordings remain unreleased to the public. The Beach Boys recorded one of Manson's songs, Cease to Exist, though they retitled it Never Learn Not to Love. It was released as the B-side of their single, Bluebirds Over the Mountain, in December of 1968, and Manson didn't get a credit, nor was he involved in the recording. Growing fearful of Manson, Wilson distanced himself from the family and moved out of the house around the same time. Following the 1969 murders, Wilson was reportedly threatened by the Manson family. Dennis did not testify against Charles Manson when Charles was later charged with numerous counts of murder and conspiracy to commit murder. In the 1978 biography, The Beach Boys and the California Myth, Wilson acknowledged his relationship with Manson and said, "I know why he did what he did. Someday, I'll tell the world. I'll write a book and explain why he did it." In 1983, however, Wilson drowned at Marina del Rey. End quote. The following is from allthat'sinteresting.com by Katie Serena regarding Dennis Wilson's relationship with Charles Manson. Quote, "Dennis Wilson didn't like to talk about it. In 1969, while the U.S. was thrown into a fraught state as Charles Manson was arrested for the Tate LaBianca murders, Dennis Wilson was asked repeatedly to discuss his relationship with the madman. As the Manson family trials unfolded and the morbidly curious followed along, captivated by the charismatic leader of the now infamous cult, Dennis Wilson could hardly avoid the pressing questions about the time Manson spent in his house. For months, the case dominated the airwaves, and Dennis Wilson had to hear it all. It's not surprising Dennis Wilson didn't like to talk about it. Since their inception in 1961, the Beach Boys had managed to create an entirely new sound fusing jazz harmonies and laid-back California style. Their 1963 song, Surfin' USA, was a massive hit, and several other albums topped the charts. But in 1968, the year that the Manson family lived with Dennis Wilson, the band was on a downward trajectory. Their two albums from 1967, Smiley Smile and Wild Honey, were their worst-selling albums to date, and they both received a tepid reception from music critics. While the band had generated somewhat of a reputation as a wholesome family unit, 4 of its members were related by blood, several members struggled with substance abuse. Brian Wilson, the band's leader and main songwriter, began to withdraw and came to rely more heavily on cocaine, amphetamines, and psychedelics. The British invasion of the mid to late 1960s hurt the Beach Boys' album sales tremendously. The quote-unquote British invasion was when UK bands like the Beatles, the Stones, and the Who really broke through in America. During this slow period in the Beach Boys' history, one member, Dennis Wilson, when he played host to a smooth-talking yet unknown rock star he knew as Charlie. It seemed that Dennis Wilson, middle brother of bandmates Carl and Brian, had a habit of picking up more than good vibrations. In 1968, Wilson was driving his Rolls-Royce through Los Angeles when he picked up 2 hitchhiking women and dropped them off at their home. Sometime later, he picked up the same 2 women. This time, however, he brought them back to his place in the Pacific Palisades. The women began to tell him about the man they were staying with, a mystical musician named Charlie, who had been serving as their spiritual guru. Wilson, a self-destructive, fame-addled good boy gone bad on the heels of a nasty divorce, was immediately intrigued. Late that night, when Wilson arrived back home after a recording session, he was greeted at the door by none other than Charles Manson. Recognizing the fear on Wilson's face, Manson got down on his knees and kissed Wilson's feet. "Do I look like I'm gonna hurt you, brother?" Manson asked Wilson. According to the biography of former Manson family member Diane Lake, the 2 got along immediately. In her words, Dennis and Charlie hit it off right away, which is not surprising given Charlie's skills at ingratiating himself with strangers. Dennis, in no rush to leave, hung out for a while, smoked some pot with Charlie, and listened to a bit of Manson's music. It was obvious from the start that Dennis liked the girls and admired Charlie's harem. "We sat at Charlie's feet and looked at him lovingly as he sang and played guitar. We made sure Dennis saw how much we idolized Charlie. We knew that was our job, without Charlie even having to tell us." From then on, Wilson wanted to be part of Manson's world. He introduced him to his friends, to his family, and eventually to his Beach Boy bandmates. "This is Charlie," Wilson would say upon introduction. "He is the wizard, man. He is a gas." Over the next several months in the summer of 1968, Dennis Wilson spent innumerable hours with Charles Manson and his groupies, even going so far as to move them into his home. Within the confines of his secluded home, Wilson and the Manson family played music, dropped acid, and engaged in group sex. Wilson spent much of his own money keeping the family afloat, feeding them and bringing them to doctor's appointments when a gonorrhea outbreak hit. Unlike Dennis, however, the rest of the Beach Boys were not as keen on Charles Manson. Brian Wilson, the leader of the group and the oldest Wilson brother, took an immediate disliking to Charles and flat out refused to work with him. Charles, of course, was trying to break into the music industry. As summers came to a close, tensions came to a head. During a recording session, Manson found out that producers had altered his music and that the Wilson team was trying to make his sound fit with the Beach Boys. Things got tense and ended with Manson pulling a knife on a producer. That would be the last time Charles Manson and the Beach Boys got together in the studio. Following this knife-pulling incident, the rest of the band urged Dennis to cut ties with Charles Manson. He did, but before he did, Dennis made one last reckless move. In December of 1968, the group recorded Never Learn Not to Love on the B-side of their single, Bluebirds Over the Mountain. Little did people know that the song Never Learn Not to Love was originally known as Cease to Exist and was written by Charles Manson. The song title was changed, some of the lyrics were refined, and when the song was eventually released, the only writing credit was given to Dennis Wilson. Not long after the release of the song, Dennis Wilson awoke one day to find a bullet in his bed. Charles Manson would later take responsibility. In a now famous interview with journalist Diane Sawyer, Charles Manson said the following: "I gave Dennis Wilson a bullet, didn't I? I gave him a bullet because he changed the words to my song." End quote. Reasons to accuse Manson of the Tate LaBianca murders immediately. They believed he'd shot someone dead, he threatened 2 of them with violence, and they knew he'd stockpiled guns and knives at the ranch. And the slaughter at Melcher's old house was exactly the kind Manson predicted, down to the most chilling detail. Shouldn't they have connected the dots, or was it possible that there was a conspiracy of silence among them? End quote. One theory a lot of people have is that Manson was some sort of a CIA asset, and that, in general, much of the popular music coming out of Los Angeles in the 60s was a government psyop. It might sound completely crazy at first, but the more you dig into it, the more and more it makes sense, at least to an extent. Some people believe, for instance, that Jim Morrison, one of the most prominent figures of 1960s Los Angeles, was also some sort of a CIA plant or something like that. Interestingly, as I've mentioned in a previous video, the police actually questioned Jim Morrison about the Manson murders. Why? I don't think Jim had anything to do whatsoever with the Manson killings, but Jim did know Manson personally. Perhaps somehow the police got wind of this. That is a subject I'm still researching. I'd really like to know why the police questioned Jim. Now, for those of you who may be surprised that Jim and Manson knew each other, it's true. Even Jim Morrison's Doors bandmate Ray Manzarek has stated that Jim and Manson knew each other. The question is, did they know each other well, or were they not too familiar with each other? What exactly was the nature of Jim and Manson's relationship? I am making a separate video about the overlooked connection between Jim and Manson. I will post a link to that video in the description box here once it's ready. In any case, as mentioned, lots of people believe Manson was part of a government psyop, and that many prominent figures of the 60s music scene from Los Angeles, including Jim Morrison, were also a psyop. The Jim Morrison example is particularly interesting to me, not just because the police questioned Jim about the Manson murders, but also because President Nixon and the FBI kept a close eye on Jim. Nixon and the FBI considered Jim Morrison dangerous. They considered him subversive. As one of the leading figures of the hippie movement of the anti-Vietnam War movement, Jim Morrison was not somebody that the government looked upon nicely. The Miami incident gave them the public cover they needed to finally go after Jim very aggressively. I've discussed the Miami incident previously, but for those of you who may not be familiar with it, on March 1st, 1969, during a Doors concert in Miami, Jim Morrison allegedly pulled out his private in front of a packed house. To this day, there is no definitive evidence to prove or disprove that Jim did that. But regardless of the lack of evidence, this alleged incident led to a massive public controversy, which the FBI and President Nixon used to their advantage against Jim. The first thing I want to do here is read to you a quote from Jim Morrison Life-Death Legend by Stephen Davis, where he breaks down how the FBI and President Nixon went after Jim. Quote, "The FBI files, the dossier concerning Jim Morrison, contains a report on the infamous Miami show from March 1st, 1969, where Jim allegedly pulled out his private. The name of the FBI informant is blacked out. The informant declared that Jim exposed himself. According to the file, the informant advised that he is conducting an investigation and warrants will be obtained for Jim Morrison's arrest on misdemeanor charges. The matter will be discussed with the Florida State Attorney's Office to determine if Jim Morrison can be charged with a felony." Now, on March 5th, 1969, a few days after the concert, Larry Mahoney, a young reporter for the Miami Herald, reported that the Miami police had issued an arrest warrant for Jim, charging indecent exposure and disorderly conduct by profanity. Jim Morrison was in big trouble, much bigger than anyone realized. Officials at both the FBI and the Nixon White House believe that Jim Morrison had previously made threats against President Nixon. Whether or not Jim actually threatened or was a threat to Nixon was irrelevant. This Miami case presented the authorities the perfect opportunity to finally shut Jim up. The FBI's notorious COINTELPRO operation was currently neutralizing, sometimes violently, the government's critics and perceived enemies. They were, for instance, already harassing John Lennon, who had made outraged statements against Nixon's policies. The details that can be gleaned over from Jim Morrison's censored FBI file, plus the prosecution and subsequent police threats against Jim, seem to indicate that no less than the director of the FBI himself, J. Edgar Hoover, may have had a hand in the persecution of Jim Morrison. President Nixon himself sent a letter of support to a quote-unquote rally for decency held at the Orange Bowl in Miami on March 23, 1969, to protest the behavior of Jim Morrison. Meanwhile, the Doors' lucrative tour was suddenly canceled. The Concert Halls Management Association put out the word that the Doors were poison. Their insurance company canceled their policies. Big money dates in Jacksonville, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Toronto, Detroit, Boston, etc., were immediately spiked. Suddenly, almost mysteriously, the Doors dropped off the radio, as if they've been banned from airplay. And this wasn't just in March. For instance, scheduled summer shows in Seattle and Hawaii were also canceled. Rumors circulated that local FBI offices were warning promoters to stay away from the Doors. Letters concerning the quote-unquote filth the Doors were peddling continued to find their way to J. Edgar Hoover and were subsequently filed in the Doors' FBI dossier. The following year, in August of 1970, Jim Morrison was back in Florida for trial proceedings. It seemed obvious to various observers that Jim Morrison was being railroaded to prison under the watchful eye of the Nixon administration. Somebody was out to break the Doors financially and physically. No one in the media was going to stand up for Jim in his hour of need. On October 14, 1970, Jim taped an interview with the rock magazine Circus. During this interview, Jim said he was facing prison time and that he was worried about it. In Jim's own words, he called the Miami trial more a political than a sexual scandal. Jim Morrison's first rub-in with the FBI, however, wasn't the Miami trial of '69. It goes back at least a year earlier to 1968.
February 1968. One morning, America woke up, turned on breakfast television, and watched in awe as a barefoot peasant militia battered American troops and took over the major cities of South Vietnam. This was the fabled Tet, Lunar New Year offensive, when the Viet Cong almost overran the South Vietnamese army and their American allies. South Vietnam was saved only after bloody pitched battles. Famous quote, "We had to destroy the village in order to save it." From that moment on, the great mass of Americans knew the Vietnam conflict was lost. The war dragged on for 7 more years at enormous and disgraceful costs to American lives. The Doors, to their credit, did their best to stop the carnage. They had been performing The Unknown Soldier, their acute and furious protest song, for the past several months. Their Soldier promo clip, meant to be broadcast but immediately banned for its violence and amateurish production values, was shown at Doors concerts beginning the following month. The audiences were stunned, and a few even realized they had seen one of the most intense anti-war statements that Americans had ever committed to film. It was around then, according to the heavily censored Federal Bureau of Investigation files on the Doors, that a group of radio executives in the South sent letters to the FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover suggesting that the Doors were disseminating enemy propaganda and damaging civilian morale with their obscene performances and anti-war messages.
End quote. Now, some people believe that Jim Morrison may have also been a CIA asset. I covered this in my previous video about Jim and Manson, but for those of you who haven't seen it, here's a quick recap. Jim's father, George, was an important figure in the U.S. Navy, so much so that George Morrison was directly involved in the famous incident, which led to increased U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. On August 2, 1964, the U.S. Navy and the North Vietnamese Navy exchanged fire. George Morrison, Jim's dad, was in command of American forces during this confrontation. 4 North Vietnamese were killed and 6 more were wounded. On the American side, there were no casualties, but regardless, this incident, now known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, famously gave the Johnson administration the quote-unquote justification they needed to escalate U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. Some people find it too much of a coincidence that Jim Morrison, one of the biggest counterculture icons ever, had a father who was not only a prominent member of the U.S. Navy, but who was directly involved in the incident widely regarded as the catalyst for increased U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Jim, of course, is not the only prominent figure from the 60s hippie scene that people believe may have been a government plant. Going back to Charles Manson, there are a lot of people who think he was a CIA asset of some sort. While this has never been confirmed, there is quite a bit of information which does suggest Manson may have had government ties. As mentioned, after the horrific Manson murders in August of '69, the police actually questioned Jim Morrison about the murders. The following is from Jim Morrison, Life-Death Legend by Stephen Davis. Quote, Charles Manson dispatched his witchy young legion into the town, where they butchered movie star Sharon Tate in her Beverly Hills home, which belonged to record producer Terry Melcher. Another victim that was murdered that night on August 9, 1969, was Jim Morrison's former hairstylist, Jay Sebring, along with 4 other victims.
Heavy-duty paranoia descended upon the land. About a month later, for reasons that remain unclear, Jim Morrison was questioned by police detectives investigating the Tate LaBianca murders. There was a rumor going around town that Jim had talked about the murders before they happened. Jim may have also been tied to the case through Sebring, or through connections in Topanga, where the Manson family had lived, or through acquaintances with one or more of Charlie's girls. Over the years, several of these still imprisoned women have claimed that they knew Jim Morrison, but similar claims about other contemporary celebrities are considered highly suspect and remain unproven.